Committee, and Beth Barron and Steve Cochran asked me just to make some introductions and try to facilitate tonight's meeting. First, thank you all for coming out. And is John Heidler here?
Right.
I just wanted to say thank you for your work to find a night where we could get a lot of the principal people in the room and the folks who've been working very hard. So thank you for your effort to make it work out tonight. And I have to thank Steve. As everybody knows, he's announced his retirement. And at Tuesday's board meeting, we actually voted to let him retire. Controversial, but unanimous. And we're going to miss him, and we're going to miss him tonight because he's at the Send Hunger Packing event that's going on tonight, where a number of other members of the board and friends of the schools are. Let me make a couple of introductions. First up front is Rebecca Auger and Pat Gallagher from Milone MacBroom, our planners. Rebecca is the co-lead with Mike Zuba on the Princeton Public Schools project. Bob Powell from Nassau Capital Advisors, who advises about 40 municipalities and districts in the state. He's a Riverside grandparent, and he has been providing his expert services on a pro bono basis. And Ralph Widener, a longtime member of the National Academy of Public Administrators, and considered one of the deans of public administrators in the country, who's done work not just on behalf of our country, but on behalf of many other countries as well. We have 4 board members here, and if you could each just raise your hand. Debbie Braunfeld, Dan Dart, Beth Barron, and Brian McDonald again. We also have a former board member, Harry Levine, who's just a few years ago, he's thinking former board chair.
Yeah.
So
You can't escape Harry.
you can talk to him about
It's all his fault.
yeah. And Harry, I hear you're thinking of running again. That's really
Running away.
Our business administrator, Matt Bolden, is in the back of the room. He is probably going to finish balancing the budget while we have this meeting. And Scott Sillers, from the longtime chair of Citizens Finance Advisory Committee, who has never met a spreadsheet he didn't want to really tear apart. And, where'd he go?
He's right here.
Oh, right here.
Better seat.
All right.
That's right.
I also want to recognize a couple members of the community who have done a lot of work since the January 25th event. Jen Chen, I think I saw come in. He's here. Wendy Wilton is also here. And I am hoping that Joel Schwartz will come. He has shared a lot of information with members of the board and with Rebecca, and has some interesting perspectives. And all of those will be welcome tonight. Let me just remind everybody of the purpose of the meeting. We're going to be talking about enrollment, trends, and projections. So on the 25th, Rebecca and Mike and members of the team talked about the 4 components we're looking at as part of the planning process. The first is enrollment and enrollment growth. The second is the capacity of our schools, including our fields. The third is the condition of our schools and fields. And the fourth is their suitability for 21st century pedagogical best practices. Tonight, we're just returning to the first topic, enrollment. And so I think there are 2 new decks that have been put up on the website. You just go in about the district, and there's a future planning. One is there are a few revisions made to the main deck that was presented on the 25th. And then there's tonight's deck, which is just on enrollment. And Rebecca will note where there have been any clarifications or modifications made. I hope the way this is, first of all, I'm going to turn over to Ralph so he can just explain the work of the enrollment committee and kind of how we began the process of talking about the numbers. And then Rebecca and Pat will present. And rather than wait to the end, I think that if there are some questions as we go, maybe every 2 or 3 slides, somebody could just raise a hand. We've got a second microphone, or you can just, use your outside voice, and we'll
use the microphone maybe for the sake of the video.
Yes, I should also note that we are being recorded. Some people who couldn't be here tonight asked us to record it, so it might be helpful to use the microphone for their benefit. Thank you, Raisa. What else? I am going to look to Jen and Wendy and Joel probably before others, because I know they've been working on this, so if they have questions, I may call on them before I call on other people. And hopefully we'll move kind of quickly. Questions will be questions. No graduate student dissertations at this meeting. I'm looking at you, Greg. And board members, of course, jump in whenever you want. Feel free to grab the mic and say whatever it is, or ask whatever questions you want. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ralph.
You want me up there?
No, you can sit right here. Why don't you sit right here?
You might punch up the thing I got on the computer there. I was asked to do two things at the beginning here, and I don't want to use up too much of your time. The first, as the former chair of the former committee, wanted to explain a little bit of what we did and then why, at least I favored transferring this over to the work that Milone and MacBroom are doing. And when Rebecca discovered that I was preparing some of the material that our committee was charged with developing to explain what was happening to the town overall, I'll give you a few slides of that at her suggestion. So let me just tell you that the committee was formed back early last year to oversee and guide the enrollment projections that a demographer that had already been retained and just started work was doing. And I must say the members of that committee were very intense, dug deeply down into everything that demographer was doing. We brought up every issue that we could imagine and hammered away on those projections for most of the spring and summer. We finally decided to develop two sets of projections. One set is required by the state of New Jersey's Department of Education. They have a particular methodology you have to follow, so that set was developed. And then we took another set with Bob Powell's help that took into account what we knew then about what our affordable housing obligations were going to be and tried to build that into a set of projections. And let's see, we'll save comments on the projections that we finally developed until Rebecca starts her presentation, because then you can see it all together and where we are. But basically, where we came out was that we anticipated an increase somewhere between 10.4 and or around 10%, one way or the other. But the two projections came out very close together. By no means were these finished. Primarily, we did not know what the final decision was going to be on the affordable housing issue, and we didn't know what the actual enrollments were going to be for 2019, 2020. And they came in October, and we still didn't have the affordable housing decision. We were handing off the responsibilities to Milone and MacBroom at that point. So there was a number of questions hanging in the air with these projections. And so the understanding at the handoff was that they would look at those, review them, offer any comments and corrections, and then do projections of their own using their own methodology to see how they matched up. And I suggest any comments about all this, wait until we get to their presentation, because then it's all up on one slide and we can look at everything together rather than in a fragmented, in a fragmented way. So we did the handoff. Now, I should say that not everybody in the committee was in favor of handing this off to a consultant, but I was, and so were several other members of the committee. And the reason was, as I looked down the road at what we were doing, I realized that the one demographer we had was not going to have the capacity to do some of what had to be done. In addition, we as volunteers didn't have the capacity to do some of what had to be done. And we tried to figure out where would we find the staff. Could we rustle up volunteers from the university or wherever? And when the board was playing with the idea of hiring a consultant, I said that's the way to go. And the reason for that is that there were questions, for example, about what was happening in various areas of the town where the Geographic Information System, GIS, would have been an invaluable asset. And we simply, as volunteers, didn't have access to that, so we needed help on that. In addition, we're going to get to the migration into the town and out. And that's a very complicated set of data. And the census data is useless for one reason. We have a lot of people who come in from abroad and then leave and go back out. We know how many come in and where they come from. But once they go out, the census, which I was using, has no way to track them. So you have a blank. And so we had a very complicated in-migration, out-migration issue, which fortunately Milone MacBroom can work up, from the bottom up on. The other reason was that there was going to be a lot of legwork involved. And it was clear that I was going to have to do a lot of that legwork. And you know, Steve's retiring to take care of his 91-year-old mother. And I'm about to turn 90. So I figured that three times in the last 12 years, I've compiled a comprehensive statistical profile of the town. And each time on the brink of divorce, because I spent 3 months for a full day in front of a computer grinding out this stuff. And nobody comes to talk to me. And finally my family got tired of it. And I said, I'm going to do it a fourth time. They said, no way. Well, we're doing it. So the mission of the committee to develop the broad overview or narrative or general story about what's happening to Princeton, I began working on while we were working on these projections. But the problem was that the census data for 2018 wasn't available until mid-December. So essentially, that's what we're working on now. And what we wanted to show you, let's get down 2 slides. I'm going to show you, first of all, something that has just come out from Rutgers. And I brought some excerpts from it up here for those of you who are interested. But the reason I want to give you a little briefing on this is it explains some of what we're going to encounter as we look at the peculiar statistics of Princeton. Let's flip to the next slide. This is the New York area, 35 counties of the New York area, which includes us down there. But what's interesting is they included Bucks County over in Pennsylvania. But anyway, up there in New Haven is where Milone and MacBroom are based, and here we are down where that red dot is. And this study is a very profound analysis of what's happening in this area. We're losing about 1.4 million from 2010 to 2018 moved out of this 35 county area. And we had about 935,000 international migrants come in. And that plus the births mean we had a slight population increase here, but 34 out of the 35 counties have an absolute outmigration of their domestic population. And the problem for the future, if the international migration tapers off, which it's probably doing right now, is that we may wind up with severe labor shortages and a variety of other things that are going to affect the economy of the area. And it has a whole set of implications we can't go into here tonight. But what's interesting is, if we went back to the beginning, 2010 to say 2015, you all remember about how the millennials were all wanting to live in the cities. They were going to Brooklyn, they were going to Seattle, they were going to San Francisco, but they didn't want to live in the suburbs, they didn't want to commute, they didn't want to live in the rural areas. They were all going into these magnet metros where there was a lot of high tech. And that was true for New York. And New York has evolved into a very major center in the high-tech field. And the three counties in New Jersey immediately adjacent to New York City benefited from that. So Jersey City and Hoboken and so on, getting a lot of these millennials and so on. Well then, around 2015, this trend changed. Why? The cost of housing was getting so high in the center that they were coming out. But then another change began to occur. As they aged and got married and frequently had kids, they began to move out to the suburbs. But they didn't just move out to any old suburb. They didn't, back in the old days, people were going way up toward the Poconos and areas like that. They were way out on the edge. They were just going to places that were semi-urban, where they were walkable, where they had urban amenities, where they had a town, and they were valuing particular places. And that's what's going to explain some of the peculiar phenomena we'll see here. Let's go down to the next slide. I'm just going to quickly give you a couple of census slides that back up what you're about to hear, but look at it from a slightly different perspective. You're going to hear a lot about housing sales and building permits and so on. I just look at people and use the census. And the household population, which is our population without counting the college students in dormitories and the people in medical care centers, is the people living in housing that put the kids in the schools. If you look at that, it only jumped a modest 0.7% between the 2000 census and the 2010 census, but it jumped 10% by 2018 according to the census estimate. And by the way, these estimates they have a large margin of error. And I've got a handout here if anybody's interested. It explains when you use these and when you don't, and how do you have to be careful in using them. But I'm going to skip over all the complications and just give you the general picture. So our household population jumped by about 10%. Let's go to the next slide. And what's interesting is, see that red line down the middle? Well, the trend was upwards in the first part of the decade as we were coming out of the recession. But you begin to have a real burst of growth after about 2015, 2016. Let's go to the next slide. That, by the way, were the move-ins that we were experiencing. People in owner-occupied housing and in renters. And yet, the number of students per household in the town stayed the same. Now, a big question came up. We knew the births were dropping off rather dramatically, not only here, but across the whole country. And the question was, well, why, if the birth is dropping, why are we worried about having more kids? Well, the problem is, the kids are getting born somewhere else and coming in. What you have is a train with more cars in it, and boxes. There are fewer boxes in each car, but there are more cars. So the number of kids per housing unit, even though the number of people in the household, let's go to the next slide, the number of households jumped. You can see that the owner-occupied homes roughly increased by about 179, and the rentals about 279. Let's go on to the next. And households with children, of those households, about 189 had kids, and those kids are what account for some of the increase we see in the enrollment in the latter half of the decade. So essentially, let's go to the next slide. This is the 2010 census. As you can see, the underage 5 is the blue, and the orange is the ages 5 to 17. That's the kind of jump the census is estimating. The numbers won't quite match what you're about to see because these are rough estimates. Okay, let's go to. Now, if we think about what's happened to the town during those 10 years, it's rather interesting. If you go back to 2010, a little more than half of the workers who lived in town had lived here and worked here. And the rest out-commuted. When you get to 2018, the number who work in town and live in town is roughly the same, but we've added over 1,000 or about 1,500 new working residents, the vast majority of whom out-commute, many of them to New York. That's that phenomenon we were seeing in the Rutgers report of people coming out of the city, moving to places like Princeton, and then commuting back. I have 2 households on each side of my property that have just been renovated or tore down and rebuilt, and in both cases, that's what happened. So basically, for them, we are a suburb, not a town of people who live here and work here. Okay. The move-ins pretty much reflect what I just said, but what's interesting is to look at the orange bars there. We have a lot of people who come in from overseas and go back, but we've also had a substantial number of people who move in from overseas and stay. But that's probably going to begin to taper off. Some of the forces that led to some of that migration are beginning to taper off. In addition, we're a somewhat less friendly country than we once were to migration, so that's having an impact. Okay. Now, a couple more things. If you look at the age of the people who've been moving in, kind of an interesting spike. The blue bar in each of these clusters is the most recent. And you see that we're seeing a big bubble in the 5 to 17-year people. The 18 to 24 people, who are the people who come here to go to college, is staying pretty much the same. The graduate student age group is higher than it was in the earlier years of the decade, and they have families. They're the ones that live in Berwick and so on. And the 30, there, but you see in the final 2 circles, the 35 to 44 and 45 to 54, these are a lot of these people are people who are the households we described as moving in under the new pattern that we're seeing of people moving out to places that have these characteristics. Okay, I think I'm almost finished here. Yeah, that gives you some background for thinking about some of what we're going to see in terms of numbers, because all of us, I think, are bewildered. There was one last, all of us are bewildered by some of what we've seen, and we've got to understand that we're part of a system that's much larger than our town, and this impacts our town and impacts much of what we see. So, okay, I'm pretty prepared.
I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
I've been part of the complete count committee for the census for 2020, and you referenced, I was using my outside voice. You referenced that some of the numbers that we're experiencing aren't what the demographers projected, and some of that has to do with the people that have moved here and are out commuting. But I also wonder, in your 2018 census numbers, our efforts are all being spent on this hard to count populations. So those wouldn't necessarily be included in a mid-census estimate, right?
No, the irony is, in a way, they are. We don't want to get too much into the complications of the census debate, but just to put it in brutal terms, in 2000, the Congress decided that the decadal census that's mandated by the Constitution can only be a direct count, and that nothing that could be done in that census that was based on other than a direct count. Now, it used to be in 2000, when we got the census, some of us would get what's called the long form, and we would respond to the long form. That's out. And what you have now is the annual American Community Survey, which has its limitations we don't need to talk about. But in that survey, they have a way of indirectly inferring the existence of the people that they used to be able to infer from the direct census that they're no longer allowed to do because it depends on surveys. So they're in what's called imputed in these estimates. But there are problems with that actually, they're rotten at counting college students in dormitories. So we can't rely on those numbers. And we don't know for sure that they've got exactly the right number of people, say, if they're piled up in a room, migrant workers and so on. But they do a pretty good job of estimating in the ballpark of how many there are.
I just wanted to make the point that I think the numbers are probably higher than what the census says.
They are, as a matter of
because
fact,
of the
when you
hard
saw
count.
them, when you see the population estimates for Princeton, they are going to be higher, but not just because of them, but because we have more college students than the census thinks we have.
Okay.
Can I ask a question? Sorry, which one over here? First of all, like apologies for people that have to do forecasts, because I do forecasts and it's the most thankless job because the realm of possibilities are infinite and the forecast is always wrong. But when you look at this, I understand that a lot of the different variables might change, like the number of households with kids, where people are coming from, theoretically how friendly the government is to immigrants 4 years from now. Like all that is on the, we can't predict.
Right.
But I guess hearing your presentation, is it too simplistic to say, look, we looked at households, family households, therefore you need a house, right? Could we simply look at the available housing stock and make some appropriate assumptions based upon what we think is going to happen in terms of development and use that as the baseline? And everything else is nice, but it's more around the edges.
Actually, you're going to build more houses. So the issue that we're going to be discussing tonight, and probably over a period of time, I hope we all get involved in it, because we need to do this together as a community. I mean, it's the kids that we're worried about. So there are really three different ways of looking at that stuff I just put up there. One, there are some people who think that this rapid growth we saw in the last couple of years of the decade, 4 or 5 years, is a one-off, and that we're not going to see it in the future because we build Avalon and Berwick and so on, and we're not going to see that. There's another group, and my committee to some extent is that we looked at 6 years in doing our projections, which includes some years where the growth was lower. And so our projections out are more like the past, because the recession at the beginning of the decade was a low. What you're going to see from Milone MacBroom is they're saying, well, wait a minute, look at this bubble that we have right now going on, and that bubble's not going to stop, and maybe it's going to continue into the next 5 years and maybe beyond. And therefore, we think maybe the projection needs to take that into account. We ought to use that trend. So you've got a disagreement about where the trend is and where it continues. Now, the last 2 or 3 days, thanks to the coronavirus, we recognize the problem for forecasting is there are surprises out there, like national recessions, like national calamities, and so on. You never know for sure, and so you can never say this is going to happen every year just this way. You have to constantly adjust. Way back, before most of you were born, I was in the Navy, and I was the navigator for a ship during the Korean War. Now, when we started, there were no satellites up there telling us where, so we had to shoot and use dead reckoning and so on. So we'd adjust the course each day after we realized we weren't quite where we wanted to be, and we finally got to where we wanted to be. You're going to have to do the same thing here. You do a set of projections based on whatever reasonable assumptions most of us will agree on, and then when you see maybe something's happened or we're off course, you make an adjustment. But basically the question is, you don't want to get gobsmacked by the future, and you don't want to not have the facilities necessary to accommodate kids that are coming in. So we have to make reasonable judgments about what's down the road, and we may be wrong. Anybody who tells you they can predict the future is a fraud.
Gotcha. Okay, so I'll wait to see the other slides.
Okay, so we're going to let Rebecca launch parts of the presentation for people who are with us on January 25th. You've seen some of these before. Again, Rebecca will note where there have been any changes. I think it's probably going to be easy to move at a reasonable pace. But again, if you have a question, just, let us know. When we get to the end, that's where the real action is, where we'll be talking about data and methodologies, where there may be disconnects, and what our next steps would be to kind of try to narrow in on what we all think is a reasonable kind of way to look to the future, which is what we have to find a way to do.
All right, can I just ask one very quick question of Ralph? The first slide, you showed two numbers, 401 under the growth in students over the next 10 years, and then there was 370 under the separate methodology. That included Bob Powell's original estimate for affordable housing kids.
Yeah, before we knew the final decision, yeah.
But it was, yeah.
We were trying to guess.
Okay, but
But
thank you.
that did include Bob's,
It
yeah.
did include Bob's, okay, thank you.
All right. So first, can everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay. And can I just see, who was at the January 25th workshop? Okay. So I would like to kind of focus on, I'll go through all of the slides and please ask questions along the way, but I would like to just focus on really explaining why we decided to look at a different model, and only to provide you with a different model. You now have 5 projection models in front of you. And I just want to explain the reasoning behind looking at that narrower window of the last 4 years to project out, and why we felt that you needed to consider that as you're looking at long-range planning. So, as Ralph just explained a great deal about total population change, we really just looked at change over since 2010 based on your Department of Public Health estimates, both in Princeton as well as Cranberry, compared to the county. And there's been pretty steady growth from 2014 to 17 especially, but again, as Ralph was pointing out, about 10% growth since 2010. Mercer County is only at 0.6% in that same time period. So you were significantly outpacing the county. Cranberry's growth was about 4% over the past decade or so. Looking at birth data again for Princeton, Cranberry, and Mercer County, just as a sort of barometer for how you are performing relative to the rest of the county, all on a downward trend since the late 90s, or since 2000 really. You've had a 23% decrease from 2008 to 2018, despite the fact that you were having population growth, as Ralph was just talking about. It's an in-migration factor, and we think that this data points to that as well. Relatively stable births in Princeton itself, which is the orange line, from about 2014 to 2017. Cranberry had a relatively stable and somewhat elevated birth level from 2005 to 2008, and those are your current and next 3 incoming 9th grade classes. We did get some estimates of births for 2019 at the time we were preparing these. The latest we could get was January through November, and the 2019 year appeared to be running anomalously low. We decided, because the number looked truly like an anomaly, it was preliminary data, that we would use that number that we had in the projections. However, to prepare 10 years of enrollment projections, we need to make some assumptions on births as well to get to that latter half of the 10-year horizon. So to project births, we tried to run some regression models to see if we could get some decent models to project out the next 5 years of births, and we weren't able to find any that were really statistically valid or reliable. So we resorted to using some mathematical models to project births, a linear exponential trend, and then a moving average trend. And so those dotted lines represent those various mathematical projections of births from 2020 out to 2024, again, just to feed that enrollment projection model in the latter half from years 6 through 10. I believe in the committee's work, you were assuming current
I believe it was either a moving average or it was the current birth data was just being carried forward. Housing sales and construction, as you're all aware, you had some significant building. You have in the lower chart here permitting and occupancy, so the green bar, I want to use your nifty, here represents multifamily housing permitting. So you have two significant spikes and then some corresponding spikes in occupancy represented by the red line. Residential home sales, again, you see a significant spike in 2015 and a general upward trend from 2016, 2017, and 18. So really strong housing market trends over the last few years. And then we know that you have a significant amount of anticipated housing coming. So with the final third round agreement, there's anticipation of over 880 units, which this top chart is not only the developments included in the final third round agreement, as well as a couple of developments that were already underway, already approved. About 40% of the anticipated units will be affordable. At least 100 of the units are designed for, are age restricted, so not designed for families. And on top of this, we know that there'll be a fourth round agreement that may be a similar scale as this third round, but we're not factoring that into the enrollment projections per se, but it is something to be cognizant of moving forward. And we also know that, I guess the Thanet Road, the Avalon project was approved by council last week, is it? So we know that these are moving forward. There's some pretty tight timelines on some of these developments. Yes?
A quick question. When you talk about anticipated housing, can you maybe tell us that excluding the affordable housing related to housing development, what are the expected growth in terms of the local housing stock?
Outside of these projects?
Outside, yes.
Sure. So I think the question is, outside of these third round agreed upon developments, what is the anticipated growth in the housing stock? We don't have any direct numbers on that. It is apparent that there is some growth outside of major multifamily development. It's not terribly significant, but you can see there's permitting activity in the single family category, you know, in the order of 40 per year.
How does that compare to the historical trend? Was it 40 a year on average of the past 10 years? Or?
If I look at these numbers, the technical average over the last 10 years is probably more about 30, in the low 30s, but I'm looking at these numbers here, 43 in 2017, 24 in 2016, 39. I mean, it's in the high 30s to 43.
So, I guess, can I state that relative to the housing development related to the affordable housing development, the, let's call it organic growth of the local housing stock for the next 10 years is relatively small, minimal.
It's relatively small. I'm not sure that growth is necessarily the issue so much as sales of existing units. So your increasing sales trend is probably more indicative of growth in that existing housing stock.
That's right. You're talking about the churn of the existing.
Correct.
Yeah, that's right.
I have, sorry, a follow-up. Actually, back on that graph.
Sure.
Just, I know we can't predict everything. Anything we try to predict is not going to be quite accurate. If you look at the beginning of the graph on the left, where there is a rising trend as you put it out in the recent years, how would you ever, based on the model you've come up with, how would you ever be in a rising trend that would predict what then happens there as a downturn?
You wouldn't. We cannot predict a recession.
So in essence, is there any model that would ever predict a leveling or a downturn in a rising trend?
I'm sure that with more data, you could probably get to a model that might do that. But when we're looking at this simply to try to project enrollments, we're not able to factor in necessarily a downturn in the market.
Rebecca, could I say-
Sure.
There's one factor that we should bear in mind. We have a very high percentage of householders who are over 65. You compare them to the surrounding area, and we're, except for Hopewell Borough and Pennington, we have an extremely high percentage. There's a generational turnover going on, and that's basically what you're seeing with these new young families coming in. They're buying houses, in many cases owned by older people who are leaving and downsizing. So what you're doing is losing people with no children and gaining people with children in the houses that already exist. So we shouldn't get trapped by just looking at permits for new homes or new home construction. It's the people moving into the houses that already exist.
Do we have any of that
We have
information
data
about what those numbers
that
look like?
relate the people who are buying houses to the number of children in their households? Or the people who
I might be able to derive, but I don't know that there's an
Because
actual.
I was thinking a similar question that was asked earlier. We had a high rate of churn in the first years of the 2000s. And my recollection is we did not have a high rate of growth in school enrollment, even though we had a churn of resales that's almost twice as high as in the years following. So it would be interesting to look at what's the correlation between that churn and the growth of enrollment.
I guess just to get back to your question too, though, I think the models of enrollment projections that the committee had put together were using a longer window of cohort survival ratios, which is factoring in a lower housing market. Whereas our model, just to give you a different model, was showing you a higher version. And we also had a low, medium, and high. So in terms of using this information to inform your projection models, taking a longer window is factoring in a lower housing market.
Can we do this calculation for Cranberry as well?
The, looking at their housing market, we have some information on their third round agreement, and we have a little bit of information on their housing coming up. But I don't have the same level of sales information that I do for Princeton.
Wouldn't that be pertinent to the conversation?
Sure, we can look at that.
I'm
I'll show you some projections on Cranberry students in a minute.
Again, if you have a question, if you could just grab the mic, because a number of people are going to watch this, and it's be helpful for them to hear the question.
Yes, and even if you have a loud voice, it will not be picked up by the camera, so please, thank you.
So this is, I think, a minor factor compared to the affordable housing piece of this. But isn't it fair to say that permitting really doesn't mean anything, because in many cases you've got tear downs, you know, and a house is built where one used to be. So even though it's a small factor, it probably is irrelevant, I think.
All right. So when taking a look at the major housing developments that you're anticipating as a result of the third round agreement, it's important to note that 5 of the 8 developments that would likely generate students are in the Littlebrook attendance area.
So, I just want to comment, I wish you wouldn't say that, we should just say, sorry. You know, because we do have a huge issue with Littlebrook, and I think it really scares parents when you say they're so close to Littlebrook. I don't know, you know, it just scares parents because they're already over capacity. Maybe just say in the north quadrant, the right quadrant, I don't know. As someone who keeps trying to, believe me, I'm on Dodds Lane and my street has changed dramatically. Like, we got so many kids. So I don't want to scare all the Littlebrook parents anymore.
I don't want to scare them either, but I think it's an important factor to consider in planning, whether there are things that need to be done to be proactive on Littlebrook's behalf. So it's just plotting out where the developments are. There's about 645 units within the attendance zone for Littlebrook, and approximately 90 in Community Park, and approximately 40 in Riverside. We were able to, thanks to Bob Powell, get some more information on Cranberry's fair share housing agreements since the January 25th workshop. So their third round agreement is several years old by now. It authorized 4 projects, some of which are already occupied, and some of which are geared towards seniors. So the projected impact of new high school students to be generated by the remaining units to be built was estimated by Bob Powell's group to be 9 students total out through 2025. They will have to enter 4th round negotiations in 2025, but they'll be entering it with a surplus of credits from their round 3 agreement. So we're not anticipating any significant student generation from new affordable or other housing from the fair share housing agreements. So just in summary, what we're looking at from this information is strong population growth since 2014, strong housing market indicators from about that time period as well, significant new housing development anticipated over the next several years, which will likely keep that housing market, keep those housing market indicators strong, and then development in Cranberry not likely to generate a significant number of new students for the high school. Moving on to some enrollment trends, we looked at some data that was readily available to us on where Princeton resident students are attending schools. About 15% of students attend private schools. The highest rates are at the elementary and high school levels. The charter school, as you know, recently added some seats to increase their maximum capacity to 424 per year, and as you know, it's made up primarily of Princeton resident students. So what we're plotting out on the bottom here is just K through 8 enrollment of Princeton resident students that are both in your public schools and the charter school. And that is up 10% over the last 4 years. So you're growing as a community, not just within the public schools. And we know that it's important to understand that there's a lot of educational opportunities in this area, not just with the charter school, but with private schools as well. So it is important to keep that in mind if there were ever any changes in kind of the educational market in the area that may have an impact on your enrollment as well. Looking at the enrollment trends for Princeton Public Schools, again, over the last decade, the total enrollment has increased about 14%, but within just the last 4 years, the enrollment has increased 9%. And again, that's corresponding with that strong housing market, the growth in the total population, that in-migration that Ralph was speaking to earlier. The increases have been across all grade groupings, although some stronger than others. The elementary level has been up 10% over the last decade, the middle school's up 18%, and the high school's up 13%. Looking at the elementary level, just K to 5, the increase has been by 127 students over the last decade. Again, since 2015-16 though, that increase is 198 students. Your current year's enrollment is the highest of the last decade at just under 1,400 K through 5 students. This is just plotting out where students reside and the school that they attend. So all of the dots represent students. They're colored by the school that they attend. So you will see, for example, in this area you have a lot of students living in the community park district attending Johnson Park. You have previously sent some particular areas to other schools, presumably for enrollment balancing objectives. Looking at the trends at the by-school level, only Johnson Park has experienced any decline over the last 4 years, even though it's still up slightly. Community Park has increased 19% in the last 4 years. Little Brook has increased 21% over the last 4 years, and Riverside 26% over the last 4 years.
But also, sorry, I think with Riverside, we had added the pre-K and a couple other classes.
This is K through 5 numbers only.
Oh, so no pre-K in any of them? Okay.
No, because you have added seats to pre-K, so we're just trying to, and that's more on a seat basis, so
Okay.
we're just trying to look at the,
Okay.
kind of the organic growth in the elementary level.
Thanks.
Actually, just on that point, that if the pre-K, sorry. Just on that point, I think if the pre-K enrollment is less relevant to the overall picture of the enrollment, maybe just a suggestion that in other charts, let's remove the pre-K enrollment as well, because I noticed that there is almost a doubling of pre-K enrollment in 2019 to 2020, and I believe a significant part of these enrollment actually are students not being educated within the PPS facility, right? So physically, right? Yeah.
Right.
So from a sort of understanding the sort of supply demand of space and enrollment, maybe it's just helpful to highlight that fact, and so it makes it clear that.
Yeah, and I think you'll see in some charts that we've revised that we have made it clear where they're in and where they're out. So as we move forward, so.
But I don't see any notation as to that a portion of these pre-K students are not educated within the PPS facilities.
Well, they're still PPS students, they're just outside of the facilities, and we do make a note.
But I thought the purpose of this analysis is to
For facilities.
help us to
Yep,
plan
and we
facility,
do have
right?
notes
Yeah.
coming up on that.
Okay. But
Sorry, just be quick. I just want to offer a counterpoint, which is perhaps as a community we decide we would like those pre-K students to be housed in facilities that exist, which we cannot do at Little Brook because we're all crowded, or perhaps in a new facility that we might build someday. Counterpoint.
Okay, moving on to middle school trends. Again, the middle school's increased by 118 students over the last decade. Since 2015, growth has been about 8%. Your current enrollment is the highest of the last decade. You've had a general increasing trend since 2013, though you had a dip in 2017-18. You had an unusually large 8th grade class move up to the high school. And that has helped sustain the enrollment over the last few years, where at the high school you've increased 13% over the last decade. It's been low growth over the last 4 years. You've had an unusually small 12th grade cohort affecting your last 3 years of enrollment. So your peak enrollment of the decade actually occurred in 2017-18, although you're right at that level this year as well. A little more information on Cranberry students. This is new since the January presentation. So as you know, you have a send-receive agreement with Cranberry. It's been in place since 1988. You recently extended it. It's very difficult to terminate those agreements. It would require approval by the Commissioner of Education. A little bit of information on the tuition payments that you receive for Cranberry students, and that tuition has represented 6% of your operating budget revenues, at least in 2017-18. The enrollment from Cranberry has been relatively stable over the last 5 years. You can see it's about 270, 265 students, 250 this year. You had a large cohort from Cranberry that entered in 2015-16, so they matriculated out this year, and that really accounts for that drop of 20 students for this year. They represent 15.7% of your total high school enrollment this year. And that's down from previous years where it was about 16.5% to 17%. We're anticipating a decline in Cranberry enrollment over the next few years. So again, this is new information since January. we were able to get enrollment information from Cranberry Public Schools, so that's what you see in the top chart. The 9th through 12th grades that are depicted here are Cranberry students that are at your high school. There's an ungraded column simply because that's the way the Department of Education reports the information. At the time of the census, they did not know what grade the student would be in. So we took that enrollment information up at the top. We did a similar projection model as what we're doing for you, where we used a 4-year average of the cohort survival ratios and annual births to project Cranberry enrollment at Princeton High School. And we're projecting it to decrease about 11% over the next 5 years before it starts to rebound to current levels in about 28, 29. So you'll see the total here projected. You're currently at 250. We have it projected to go down to about 223 out 5 years. Okay. So then just looking at the detailed enrollment history for Princeton Public Schools, I just want to emphasize some of those unusual cohorts that are still in the system. You have this current class of 8th graders has just been an unusually small group, as well as the current 12th grade class. They've just been unusually small throughout their matriculation, even though they've been adding students to their cohort year after year after year. They are going to have immediate impacts on your middle and high school enrollments next year, because you're going to be clearing, no matter what happens with immigration, none of that matters. You have 2 small cohorts leaving those 2 buildings. You have much larger cohorts that have entered in 2016, 17, 17, 18. As they're moving up in the system, they're about 40 or 50 students greater at those grade levels than just 5 or 6 years ago. And that just has a cumulative effect as you move forward. This information, this grade by grade enrollment history, is what's used to calculate these cohort survival ratios.
Could you go back to that
Sure.
prior slide? It looks to me like
with respect to the high school, the elimination of the current cohort of the 12th grade just gets substituted by the migration in of the
For the high
middle
school,
students
yeah.
in the high school, so it kind of balances each other out. doesn't
It will, except you've had a bit of an increase in that 8th to 9th grade ratio. But so more significantly, it will impact the middle schools next year.
Quick question. Cranberry did a detailed demographic analysis that was published in July 2015 that basically indicated that their demographer felt that Cranberry's population in our high school peaked in the recent past and it was going into a long, prolonged decline. Cranberry is one of the first towns to have settled its affordable housing obligation. So have you looked at their report by Dr. Richard Ripp?
No, I'm not aware of that.
Okay, we can get you a copy of it.
Sure, thank you. Okay, so again, the cohort survival ratios are just as a grade matriculates through the system, how many students are added or taken away from that cohort as it matriculates. And it's used to determine just growth or loss in a class. I'm going to stick to the cohort survival ratios for a second here. What you can see is generally consistent numbers in the last few years. I'm going to have another slide on this, but I just want to call your attention to this birth decay column, which is just comparing kindergarten classes to the birth cohort in town 5 years previously. And there is a marked change between 2015-16 and 16-17 as you look at these numbers. You also have a very high 8th to 9th grade cohort survival ratio. That's not only because of the Cranberry students, it's also because you're likely taking back in charter school students. We're not taking back in charter school students are entering the high schools. So that is a very large number that will jump out at you as unusual. We've also calculated an estimate of migration. Again, just to try to understand the levels of in-migration, we're looking at larger sampling because we're looking at individual grade cohorts. It's a relatively small sample size. So we look at grades 1 through 7 compared to the next year's grades 2 through 8 and try to understand how many students are added or taken away from that grade grouping. And you can see, again, a pretty significant change in that you have a very stable in-migration rate over the last 4 years of about, averaging probably in the high 5% range. And it's been relatively consistent.
Excuse me, those estimates of migration, those are estimates net of migration, right?
No, this is simply looking at a change in a larger sampling of your cohorts. So it's looking at grades 1 through 7 in 1 year and the grades 2 through 8 of the next year. So yes, there's out migration, and in migration you're getting more students into the system.
So it's it's the ratio of the combined cohort numbers -1?
It's a percent change year over year, so it would be negative if there was net out migration. If it's positive,
right, but it's net. It's all netted.
Correct.
Net. Yeah, right? So if, okay, thank you.
I'm not particularly familiar with the enrollment study, this particular concept of migration, but an obvious problem I can see is that you essentially looking at the percentage change of student enrollment for grade 8 to grade 2 to 8 versus the prior year grade 1 to 7. So the percentage change embedded in that number is actually a large component. It's just the enrollment difference between grade 1 and grade 8. And if you look at the historical data, the average size of grade 8 is about 17% larger than grade 1. So by definition, that will produce a very, very large positive number. And so the percentage you highlighted, 7.1, 6.7, I think it's maybe a little bit confusing. It tends to lead to the sort of misunderstanding of interpreting these percentage number as a percentage of students coming in year over year. But in reality, I think there is a large component of that class average grade size difference that's embedded in that number.
But your 8th grade class was at some time a 7th grade class, sometime a 6th grade class. So how did those additional 8th graders get into the system?
Your average number for the, let's call it the numerator, is for grade 2 to grade 8, right? The denominator is grade 1 to grade 7.
Right.
So you're dropping off the grade 1, but included in the grade 8 in the numerator. But essentially, there's a difference of the grade size.
But I guess
grade 1 and grade
I'm getting at, you're following the same group of children from 1 year to the next.
Every year.
Right. Thanks.
So your
2010 numbers.
So your numerator is your 2 through 8 in the most recent year minus the 1 through 7 in the prior year divided by the 1 through 7 in the prior year. So it's looking at the exact same cohorts and looking at how much net change there's been.
Right.
But still, that number reflects the typical size of enrollment per grade, right? Typically, the grade 1 size is about 20% smaller than grade 8. So I just want to point out that percentage reflects that delta in it.
Correct. Yeah, your cohorts grow year over year over year over year. It's more useful for a trend analysis to see how things have changed. And I think the key point that Rebecca highlighted on this slide is that things have changed, that trend has changed pretty rapidly over the last 4 years.
Hi.
Hi.
I just have a question to put this in perspective for myself.
Sure.
If we pretend that nothing's going to change, that the population's going to be flat, then right now, as it stands, as we all move through the schools, in the elementary schools, we're at capacity and you can move kids around and you'd fit, right? At the middle school, we are over capacity.
So tonight we're going to try to stick to the enrollment
No,
projections, but there are.
I just want to,
Yes.
So we're over capacity at the middle school and we're over capacity at the high school if the number stayed flat.
So I'm sorry to do this to you, but I'm going to stick to the projections tonight. There is an additional, the revised comprehensive deck of PowerPoint slides that got put on the school's website this week. There are a couple of slides in the back that speak to capacity relative to enrollment. I think you would see that the middle school is currently above the capacity that we were calculating. The high school is not quite there yet.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so moving on to births and kindergarten enrollment. Again, I called your attention to this on those cohort survival ratios, but you can see the dramatic shift 4 years ago, where these are births in the blue line, this is kindergarten 5 years later. You know, there was some wobble here and there, but pretty consistent trend here, and all of a sudden you've just flip-flopped, and you're gaining more kindergartners than you had births. It's really just a market change. You previously saw about 80 to 85% of your birth cohort enter as kindergartners 5 years later. And what's more important is to understand that the trend in kindergarten enrollment is just not as responsive to trends in birth cohorts as it appears to have been in the past, especially for years 2016, 17 on. Again, because of in-migration of families, they're influencing enrollment trends more so than these birth trends.
So what does this do to your attempts to make point estimate projections for the future? Doesn't it say that any projections that you make from a trend are going to have what I think in the finance arena they call increased volatility, what the statisticians call increased variability about any trend that you might estimate in your model? And do your projections reflect that at all?
So we still are going to use birth cohorts as a basis for projecting the kindergarten enrollment because it's the best information that we have upon which to do that. What we're looking at this is more as a clear indicator to us that in-migration is a significant factor. And how you predict in-migration, you know, if I could do that in a reliable way, I'd be not sitting here tonight.
But the point I'm trying to make
it's
is that as a statistician, I have an allergic reaction to point estimates. I want some indication of variability of any estimate that you might make about the future. And I haven't seen any estimates of variability in any of the work I've seen in your slide decks.
We don't typically provide that. We have.
Right.
Right. All right, so moving on to our analysis of new to district students.
If I might add, I think in terms of variability, I think the attempt to provide 3 scenarios, low, mid, high, that is probably the attempt to try to capture some of the variability in the future growth scenarios.
So we try to dive into the in-migration issue and identify students that were new to the district. So we only looked at students from grades 1 through 12, assuming that all kindergartners are new, even though some of them were likely pre-K in your district as well. And we did this by looking at student IDs from one year to the next. Any ID that was present in a year but not in the prior year was considered new to the district. We know you have some in and out into the district, so we identified like 25 to 30 new to district students in 2019-20 who were actually in the district a few years ago, just not last year. So there's some of that. But as you can see from our analysis, you have pretty consistent numbers of new to district students at the elementary level, right around 200 students per year. There was some growth in the middle school numbers in 2018-19. It dropped off in 2019-20, and the growth really happened in the high school level in terms of new to district students for this year. But it's a fairly remarkably consistent number of about 500 students per year that are new to the district in grades 1 through 12. We then plotted out where those students reside, and there's some obvious hotspots within the community. And again, we were looking at it in terms of the elementary attendance boundaries. Community Park and Littlebrook had the most new to district students, with about 2/3 of all the new students since 2016-17. Johnson Park had the largest decline over the last 4 years in the number of new to district students annually, although they still were 60 students this year. And it's clear there's some churn of students due to the university and IAS, with the highlighted geographies in Johnson Park and the Riverside area.
So those are gross figures. They don't reflect losses from the corresponding geographic areas?
No, this is simply our rough analysis of new to district students. That's all this is depicting.
I'm sorry, that I don't think that, I don't understand that to be an answer to my question. If you have, for example, Community Park 2016-17, you have 200. Is that 200 who came in without respect to how many left? Or is that 200
Correct.
net of those who left?
It's 200 that came in without respect to who left.
Thank you.
I'm just curious that what is the significance in terms of this particular series data when we look at students new to the district? I assume that you'll have another slide following this as students leaving the districts, right? Isn't that everything just all captured in that survival ratio?
It is. So what we were trying to get into is there certain areas of the community where we're seeing more students arrive as new to district? Are there certain grade levels and just to dig a little bit deeper into where are those students coming to within the community? And yes, there is churn within the district. We did the same analysis. Again, it's a rough analysis just using student ID numbers. So we looked at those that did not return from one year to the next. Again, we excluded 12th graders, we excluded pre-K. So while you gain about 500 new students each of the last 3 years, you've also lost about 335 per year. So there's significant churn within the system. Again, you have the influence of some significant institutions in town. You also have competing educational offerings, so there may be some in and out from public to private, back and forth.
So this is just an overarching thought looking at this analysis, but we seem to have had an anomalous last 4 years, and one of the things that strikes me is that we had the tax law change, which happened, and the SALT cap, and that could have led to an increase in the churn amongst the senior people who live in the town, especially looking at that hotspot where people moved out of. One could say that that was the low-hanging fruit has left, I guess you could say, and you know how you're going to look at this churn going forward is, you know, it could change, right? It could change with the next president if there's another president. So, you know, that's something that I think we should look at.
That's a good point. So then we also took a look at students from recently built multifamily And just looking at the ramp up of some of these housing developments over the last 4 years and the number that are actually new to district. So these are existing multifamily developments. We have Avalon Bay here, Copperwood, and Merwick-Stanworth. These were developments that the growth committee's demographer was looking at and that the district was actually keeping tabs on in terms of enrollment coming out of these developments. Of the 200 to 230 students in these developments over the past 2 years, 55% are elementary level, 22% middle schoolers, 26% high schoolers. What we found was that, as you can see, Avalon Bay was significantly ramping up from 2015 to 2018-19 really appears to be leveling off a little bit. Copperwood has been ramping up over the last couple of years. Merwick-Stanworth, though, appears to have stabilized, significantly ramping up in enrollment from 2015-16 to 2017-18, but really been stable the last 3 years. So in terms of contributing to elevated cohort survival ratios, Merwick-Stanworth wouldn't necessarily have contributed to the last couple of years significantly, as it appears to have reached its enrollment trend. And over the last 2 years, about 24% of the students that live in these developments were identified as new to district students. So again, from that gross analysis that we just talked about. So breaking them down by development, about 30% of the students at Avalon were new to district each year, 50% at Copperwood. No surprise because they're ramping up over the last 2 years, whereas only 12% at Merwick-Stanworth. So again, just an indication that it appears to have reached its sort of stasis point in terms of enrollment, and that 12% figure would be sort of a natural churn factor at that development. So while these 3 developments are clearly contributed to the enrollment growth over the last 4 years, we see the stability at Merwick-Stanworth over the last 3. Avalon has started to slow down in terms of its growth, so it's likely reaching its sort of natural operating enrollment level. Copperwood may still be ramping up.
Can you, well, just on your last comments that we're seeing student enrollment in these 3 multifamily developments are stabilizing, well, except for Copperwood. In terms of the enrollment growth for the past, let's say 4 years, what percentage of the enrollment growth is attributable to these 4 units? Or, oh, okay,
So I'm about, you're
yes,
just always one step ahead of me here. Okay. So, all right. So the best that we could do, we weren't able to get a good land use data set to truly identify all of your single family housing versus multifamily housing. But we identified numerous multifamily developments within the community. They're of varying ages, so some of these are much older. And this is the list of the multifamily developments that we identified. I'm sure that we're missing some, but it's a fairly representative list, we felt. We compared the trends of enrollment in these multifamily developments to the rest of the enrollment in the community. So we're calling that rest of the development single family, even though I'm sure it includes duplexes, I'm sure it includes some multifamily, but for argument's sake, we're calling it single family. We also compared the enrollment in all of these multifamily developments to these multifamily developments minus Merwick-Stanworth, Avalon, and Copperwood, just to understand the different trends in all of these subgroups of housing types. We did the same calculation of an estimate of migration based on that 1st through 7th grade cohort compared to the subsequent 2nd through 8th grade cohort. And that's what all of these numbers in front of you now are. So in the top, we're showing you enrollment from our assumed single family housing within the community over the last 5 years. And what you will see is overall 3.4% total enrollment growth since 2015-16. Our estimate of migration showing positive in-migration, relatively healthy, strong in-migration, in the 4% range. In the middle is all of the identified multifamily developments, so all of those developments listed on the previous slide, and the enrollment within those. And you can see a 36% total enrollment growth from multifamily housing since 2015-16. And again, immigration has actually gone down a little bit, but it's very healthy at 10% per year or more. The last slide is the identified multifamily, but excluding Avalon, Copperwood, and Berwick-Stanworth. So this is getting at your older multifamily housing stock. And no surprise, the enrollment growth is less there because there wasn't a ramp up of opening new units. But there was still 8.4% increase in total enrollment in that older multifamily housing stock, and still 10% in migration levels.
Actually, this is very, very important data to look at. First, I think one thing that really stands out is that how moderate the growth of the sort of assumed single-family housing in town has produced for the school district, right? And the second important part is that actually this question, if you get a chance to look at for these past 4 or 5 years, how the occupancy rate of some of the older multifamily units have trended.
I don't have any information on occupancy.
Okay. Do you know any of these multifamily units had recent changes in terms of removal of age restriction of sort?
Copperwood, aside from
Okay.
Copperwood, I don't know anything about the older developments.
Are there, or you don't?
I don't know.
Okay, because these will be very, very important information to obtain in order to improve the analysis, understanding where the growth exactly came from in the past couple of years. Because it's really counterintuitive in the sense that, as you mentioned, the Stanworth property, in terms of the enrollment growth, you said that it tapered off in terms of growth, essentially flatlined. So it is quite interesting to see that level of growth of older multifamily units experience 8%. Is that maybe related to just the overall occupancy rate change? If you have 85% occupancy rate change, move to 90%, that's a significant percentage change. In any, I would say, through economic cycle, you will probably see that kind of change of public market, whether it's market rate or affordable rate, multifamily units experiencing that kind of variability in the occupancy rate.
I don't have any of that data. I'm not sure how I would be able to obtain that.
Because it is important in a way that, because it's almost like a mini Princeton in a sense. If you look at one particular multifamily housing, let's say Avalon, Princeton, Witherspoon, the total units in that complex is fixed, 280 units, right? Once the occupancy rate reaches mid-90%, there's simply no room to grow. Whatever you have is just a churn of the existing tenants, which leads to one of the biggest issue I raised in my letter, is that when we look at the historical enrollment growth, by not separating the multifamily units versus remaining, we're conflating these two, because some of these units already seeing peak sort of occupancy rate, and you should expect the student enrollments coming from these multifamily units to flatline, essentially no growth. In other words, the growth rate that's demonstrated in the past couple of years, that's included in all the survival rates, were inflated by these multifamily units having new tenants taking occupancy, and it's not going to repeat in the next 5 to 10 years.
So I understand your argument. I don't have the occupancy rate data or information to be able to say that they have reached that point.
Right. No, I think that the one data point I have is that Avalon is definitely above 90% occupancy rate, right? I think it's maybe I'm just like picky customer here. I think it's an important data points to gather to understand exactly what happened if we do. Right?
We've got about 10 more slides, but let's bookmark that issue and follow up on it.
I just want to add too that it is going to repeat because the new communities that are coming in. So this is actually going to continue at that very high level with even more housing units than what we went through with just those 3.
I don't see in the data that you have a lot of great information. I don't see any distinction between the market units and the affordable units. So going both in the last 5 years, as these 3 major projects have come on and as Copperwood has transitioned, and going forward, there's a vast difference in the number of students who live in affordable units versus the market units. That's while it's important for the schools to simply understand the overall growth, it's important for the town in making policy going forward to understand what kinds of housing units generate the most growth. And so I'd like to ask both the board and you, as you're doing all this work, going forward, to make a distinction between the growth and the numbers, the enrollment growth in affordable units as opposed to market units.
So I don't have data that enables me to tease that out. And
Just a little comment on this lady's comments, which actually is exactly the issue with this particular model. I think one thing that maybe we should lay it out so everyone knows that the overall model, the way it projects the enrollment growth, is using the cohort survival model as a base. And then on top of it, we add the additional students expected to come into this district based on Bob's estimate in terms of the per student generated from these multifamily units. So in a way, if you include this as a sort of base growth estimates for the next 10 years, and then on top of it, add additional students expected from these affordable housing related housing developments, you effectively double counted the growth.
Right.
That's the issue.
I'll be very brief, but I wanted to step in because I hadn't seen this slide or hadn't focused on it until just now. And I have an epiphany, which I just wanted to share, that goes back to what Ralph Widener was telling us at the very beginning of the evening. If we look at the growth in total enrollment from single-family housing since 2015, we earlier learned that since 2015, the growth in the number of new single-family homes in Princeton has been relatively flat. It's been probably, in the aggregate, I just did some mental math, during that period we've increased the total number of single-family homes in Princeton by about 0.4%. But we've had a growth in enrollment of 3.4% in that total stock. There's only one explanation for that. The composition of those households has changed. Not the number of households, not the number of units, but the composition. If you go down to the last data point, the older multifamily housing has produced an increase in over 8% of total enrollment growth. By very definition, we haven't created since 2015 any older multifamily units. There's clearly only one explanation for that increase in enrollment, and that is a rather dramatic change in the demographic of households that occupy those units. That's really part of what's going on in Princeton, as Ralph was trying to point out. It's not occupancy rate, it's average public school age children per household. Very simple.
why it's not? Are you so affirmative it's not?
We could do the analysis, but I'm highly confident that the occupancy rates in all the multifamily units in Princeton have remained healthy and steady over that period of time. We have a shortage of multifamily housing in Princeton, so occupancy rates are very steady and high.
Go ahead. Come on.
I just want to thank the gentleman who just came up and talked, because I was sitting in the back, having moved into Princeton 3 years ago, and surprised by the fact that around us, within the last few years, a huge number of people have been moving in at our age from elsewhere precisely to get access to the schools that are here. So it's not surprising to me at all that part of the numbers might be conflated by the fact that you have a large housing stock that may have been produced recently and a bunch of people moved in. Maybe that affected that number, but I'd say you also definitely have a huge turnover. We bought our house from a group of people, 2 people that were 90 years old and wanted to sell to a young family. We were desperate to get in and couldn't get in for lots of complicated reasons. The only thing I would say is, while I absolutely can see there would be growth in the future from the flip of the houses over time, my question would be, how long can that continue?
Mm-hmm.
Because it can't continue forever, because you'd eventually have a housing stock that has nothing but kids in it and no old people. So I think the bigger question to ask is, focusing on what the gentleman said before, how long can that flip occur? So you can separate the stock into the groups where you're going to be filling the houses over time with new people that are definitely going to be young people who are using every dollar they've got to try to get into the only housing they can afford, which is the, what do you call it, the multifamily house, 215. And then you're going to have a certain percentage of the population that you can probably calculate are going to be moving out over time, but it can't continue forever without building that base housing stock. And if you're saying that you're not going to increase the base housing stock, it's increased only 0.5% because Princeton's full and you're not allowed to subdivide, then you're going to have a baseline where you're eventually going to hit a stopping point. So that's just, it's got to be growing, because I see it growing around me. The young kids are moving like crazy around us, and we're right near CP, and that's why they're going there. But it can't continue forever. I just don't know how long it can.
Okay, so just moving on. So to put a little summary on that, while those 3 housing developments that we were looking at certainly have contributed to those higher cohort survival ratios, they're clearly not solely responsible for that. There's been enrollment growth in your single family and your other multifamily housing developments that's been strong over the last 4 years. And that consistent in-migration rate of 9 to 10% in that older multifamily stock. When we look at that and we couple it with that shift in the birth to K survival ratio over the last 4 years and those positive enrollment trends, especially in the last 4 years, that is why we decided to give you a different enrollment projection model, 3 models, based on more recent trends than that 6-year trend. That 6-year trend that the growth committee had looked at, that is based on a New Jersey standard, that is taking into account some of those years with lower growth situation happening. So it may be getting more at where you're trying to get to in saying that we're inflating the numbers.
I think the problem is this. You provided 3 scenarios of forecast.
Can we get to those scenarios? Let's just
How about we get to it and then we'll come back. All right. So the way the projection models work, we take those cohort survival ratios and we use them moving forward. It is a standard methodology for projecting enrollment. It's especially good with stable populations, and by stable I mean that the trends are stable. So it could be a stable growth trend or a stable decline trend. And those cohort survival ratios are factoring in changes in population and the housing stock and economic conditions. Again, the New Jersey standard is to use 6-year average cohort survival ratios. That's what the Sundance projection models use, and then they factored in some growth as a result of housing development. We're using more recent cohort survival ratios to capture that strong market of the last 4 years. We know that there's an extent of commitment to the fair share housing developments that are in the agreement. Avalon is moving forward again, so we anticipate housing development to begin again in the near future. And because of that, on top of Copperwood still ramping up in enrollment, natural growth trends, I would say, in the older housing stock of the community, and the fact that kindergarten enrollment has become less responsive to birth trends, indicating strong in-migration to the community. These are all the reasons why we decided to run these models on the more recent trends. So our 3 models are low, medium, and high. The low assumes the lowest of the most recent trends, so we actually ended up using a 5-year average. We used our low birth projection model, and we assumed 75% occupancy of the fair share housing units, or the student generation calculated by Nassau Capital Advisors, by 2027. The medium model assumes the 3-year trends, 3-year weighted trends of median birth projections, and we assumed 90% of the public school age children that are projected for the fair share housing agreement would be in place by 2027. The high model is using the most recent cohort survival ratio trends and 100% of these students in the multipliers provided by Nassau Capital Advisors. Some other basic assumptions: that the pre-K is increased to 100 students and remains at 100 through the next 10 years. That there's no changes to programming or availability of private and other public schools in the region. That there's phased construction of the developments in the Fair Share Housing Agreement out through 2027. And we're not factoring in any 4th round Fair Share housing obligations or any other changes in zoning that would enable greater housing development, or any changes at local institutions that might impact the housing market locally. So the district-wide projections, we're showing K through 12 here. We're showing you the Sundance models in the dotted lines of blue and green, and then our low, medium, and high models in the dashed lines of orange, green, and yellow. With any enrollment projection, our greatest confidence is in the first 5 years, because we have known enrollment data and known birth data to work with. And you can see that all 5 of the models are really in general agreement over that first 5-year period. And then as we move forward, MMI is projecting growth in the K through 12 enrollment of about 12 to 13% out 5 years, and about 11 to 20% out 10 years. We're suggesting you use the MMI medium projection models for long-range planning purposes, but you have these 5 models with which to work, and I think they all tell a similar story of anticipating continued growth, certainly over the next 5 years. Yep.
Rebecca, I made this comment to you before, but just I'll make it again. I like the fact that the sort of the deltas through 5 years are not that great. And I think from a board perspective, it provides a spectrum to focus on, and based on tonight's conversations, there may be some more granularity that we can look for, and we can continue to have a discussion on the sort of 3-4 year look back versus a longer one. I get nervous about the notion that things flatten, because on the prior slide, those exceptions are potentially huge. If round 4 is another 800 to 900 units, that could have a major impact, and those lines could go up at a significantly faster rate. The second thing is, every single member of our council has said that they want to change zoning, and will be, over the next few years, their intent, whether it happens or not, is to allow more single-family homes to be duplex, triplex, and converted to 2-family homes, which might be very attractive to families as well. And then the third thing is, while the Institute and the seminary, they really don't grow, or they grow very slowly, the university grows by 0.8 to 1% per year. And every 15 years or so, they do major bursts of housing. So with Lakeside, they did a major burst of graduate student housing. Merwick Stanworth, which had been graduate student housing, that's now basically junior faculty and staff housing. And they have a large tract, and the one thing that they haven't done lately is housing for the kind of intermediate faculty and staff and the more senior faculty and staff. And that could add a couple of hundred units, probably in the 10 to 14 years old. So I just wanted to note that if somebody looks at this and says, well, I see you've got a challenge for 5 years and then it flattens, I don't know how much confidence we can have in that flattening, since those exceptions are very, very, potentially very large and impactful ones.
Thank you. I have a quick question. When Sundance did its model, Bob had come up with preliminary projections. And then we were blessed with a final court-ordered affordable housing settlement where he revised his number down by 124 to 130 public school-age children. But I know that was not captured in the Sundance models. Is it reflected here that
Yes, we are using Bob's revised numbers.
But it's not in the Sundance models then?
Correct.
So there's a greater difference between your model and the Sundance model then?
In the latter half of the projection horizon.
Rebecca, I have a question. With regard, going back a couple of slides, you have very specific data about numbers of the enrollments at Avalon and Merwick Stanworth and Copperwood. You indicated that there was specific growth in the older multifamily. What is the source that you use to determine the growth in enrollment in those 15 or so projects?
So we have enrollment information by resident address, and we simply used addresses that we could identify as being a part of those multifamily developments. We don't have an understanding of unit occupancy.
Understood, thank you. Is it possible for that information to be shared the same way we have information about 3 large projects? There's 15 other projects which collectively add up to a lot. Can that information also be provided, broken down project by project? As you did for Avalon and Merwick?
So,
yeah, I mean,
Milone MacBroom gathers and takes a lot of the information that we give them.
Right.
So I guess the question they might have for us is, if you can get us that information, we might be able to do something with it.
But,
I mean, we have it, but to some degree, it's student information that at some point, there's some privacy issues there as well.
That's what I'm confused about. I mean, you don't have a privacy issue to indicate that there's 83 students at Avalon. So why is there a privacy issue to indicate that there's X number of units at Governor's Lane, for example?
So that is information that was out there already and that the district was clearly tracking on its own.
So maybe I should direct that question to the district. I mean, is there any sort of privacy issue about the public knowing how many kids live at Governor's Lane as opposed to knowing how many kids live at Avalon?
I don't know, Matt?
Not on face, unless the development was so small that you would be able
to
potentially identify.
Okay, and so if it gets below a certain threshold, I can see that, but these are all substantial numbers. Is there any reason why you couldn't prevent?
I think it's a good thing to look at.
Okay, a similar question about the single family. You had indicated that there was a certain amount of growth in enrollment in single family homes in Princeton, which represents, there's, let's say, 9,000 single family homes in Princeton, or 8,000, or some huge number. How do you know how much, what's your source for the data on enrollment deltas in single family homes with such a large number of single family homes and so much constant churn?
So again, that was more based on the remainder. We had identified students residing in those multifamily developments. The remainder is what we're, as I explained, assumed single family, which it's not just single family.
So I'd like to make a request that just, so since there are a lot of people here who are obviously interested in the numbers, if that information be, so what you're saying is that like I said, it's the remainder. All the more important to see, we know what the total growth is, we now know what the growth is or what the enrollment is at 3 major projects. hopefully the board will, provide information about the other 15 or so projects, with the exception of maybe really small ones for privacy concerns. That way we can be in a position to just understand where all the numbers are coming from.
We can ask the staff if they can do that.
I guess I'm not sure how much different that would be from the numbers that we were showing you.
I think it will make a huge difference in a way that, as a former member of the enrollment committee, I remember, I think Ralph, you can attest to that, the main mission for the enrollment committee was to identify the key drivers of the enrollment growth of the past couple of years and hopefully pinpoint the potential driver for the future enrollment growth in the next 10 years. I think M&A did a lot of good work on analyzing the data. One of the key issues I find that is that after seeing this presentation, I'm struggling to understand what exactly are the factors that drove the enrollment growth for the past couple of years, and what are the factors that will continue to drive enrollment growth for the next couple of years, next 10 years, other than the fact that we're talking about the housing development related to the affordable housing. I think that's critically important, because a lot of the information provided essentially is an analysis of historical data itself. It's almost like, the stock market was down the day before, yesterday, it was down yesterday, it was down today. So can we predict that the stock market will be down a week from today? No, right? There are people doing this kind of analysis, but I think for us, for a community to make such a big decision to understand where the enrollment picture is growing, I think it really helps us to understand exactly what are the driving forces behind it. And you guys talk about the sort of in-migration. I feel like this is just another word for looking at the same data: housing transactions, population. That's the thing I think we really need to spend energy on. Hold on a second.
Jan, I think, here, let me respond to this. I don't mean to speak for the board, I'm speaking for myself. It's clear to me that the two drivers that we need to think about focusing on for the future is, number one, the fact that we have to provide more multifamily housing under the new agreement. Number one, we know that. Number two, my attempt at the beginning, which was probably ineffective, was to show that the driver for a lot of the other growth are people moving into town who have kids in order to take advantage of the schools. And if you look at what's driving that now, that's likely to persist for a while, but the cycle may go up and down because of the national economy and so on. So we can't predict it's a line, but we know that those people with kids are out there and they're now looking for homes in places like Princeton, and that's what drives that growth. It's that simple. And they're not all houses that have to be built. They're buying houses that old guys like me own and are leaving. So you've got an old set of householders who are going to be selling their houses, and these young people who can afford them will be buying them. And that's the driver. I don't know why we have to bang so hard on that. It's people who move to here to get schools. And now that trend may change. They may decide, no, we need to go back to Brooklyn. But right now, they're not. They're coming here. How long that's going to persist, nobody can predict.
Let's just finish the last three slides.
It's important, sorry.
I'll give it to you next.
No, I just want to respond to what Ralph just said. Sorry. It is important that you say that the people coming into town buying houses, but if we look at these breakdown of the student enrollment growth, clearly in the past 4 years where this town experienced very strong growth of enrollment, but if we look at that single family cohort.
It's not just single family, it's the apartments that we're going to build. We're going to be building all
That's another issue. That's another issue, Ralph.
No, that's the same issue.
We want to be able to take the growth
and generally allocate it between how much we think is coming from the new growth in the new multifamily units, the growth that is coming from increased migration into existing housing stock and existing multifamily, and do a generalization of what those two pieces are at least.
Yes.
And
We haven't seen that in those.
I think
And possibly think about if there's any SALT impact.
I think it is very easy to take personal experience as, say, my neighbors, they're living here 30, 40 years, they're moving out, and the young couple is moving in. But hold on. We actually discussed this during the enrollment committee meeting. One of the hard facts is that if you look at the population, the demographic composition of the town, the percentage of senior citizens actually increased over the period you're talking about.
You know why? They
it's
had a
not,
birthday.
What?
You had a birthday. That's the war babies becoming 65.
But-
It's not in migration.
But hold on. We're talking.
Please, Jen, can we just finish the presentation?
Move on.
Let other people ask
Yeah.
questions and you and Ralph can talk after, please.
Yes, agreed.
All right, let's hope for that. I just have one more point. Hold on. This is important, isn't it? We brushed on the topic about double counting. Can you maybe confirm, is that an issue or not?
So this is an alternative model to the Sundance models, which we're getting exactly at what you were just suggesting, right? If I don't want to try to explain Mr. Sundell's models. You guys went through several iterations, but he was trying to tease apart for you growth in those multifamily developments versus the underlying growth. So this is an alternative model that is looking at the fact that there is natural growth over the last 4 years apart from the new housing units that were built
We're not
and
talking
ramping
about
up in occupancy.
that
And
model.
I will get there, please. So we are using those cohort survival ratios from the last few years, and we are adding a percentage of the assumed children coming out of the additional housing units. It is intentionally a higher model than the Sundance models were, because we are using that shorter term window of growth as the baseline growth.
Is double counting an issue for your model?
We don't believe it is an issue. I'm explaining how it is developed. You are going to believe it's an issue no matter how much I stand up here and say anything to you. So I'm going to just move on at this point.
Yeah.
The median projection model, which we are recommending, best fits the current data. It incorporates some of that occupancy ramp up. It also is incorporating 90% occupancy of those future students from future housing. It projects 12% growth out 5 years. It sees growth continuing out 7 years before flattening, and it's flattening because that's the point at which we're no longer adding students from the new housing units. Most of that growth, again, is felt in the middle and high school levels. Again, you have some larger cohorts in the system. I talked about that elementary level where some of your cohorts are now 40 to 50 students more per class than they were just a few years ago. Those cohorts are going to be matriculating through the system, as well as you have some smaller cohorts, especially in the middle school this year, that will be clearing the system, so you see an immediate jump in 2020-21 at the middle school level. We're assuming that in-migration continues. These are the detailed numbers behind that chart I just showed you. Again, our greatest confidence is in the first 5 years, so that's why the 2024-25 year is highlighted. Taking a look at the by-school projections, again, why we make the point earlier in the presentation about most of that new housing development located in the Littlebrook district is because it will have an impact on Littlebrook. This is assuming that you don't make any changes to your current attendance zones or your current program offerings. Because of the location of many of those units, Littlebrook would see significant growth. This does not account for 100 pre-K students, so this is solely about enrollment projections. This is not about facilities at this time, so we're not factoring in the 100 pre-K students. We know that the district intends already to send IAS students to Johnson Park next year instead of Littlebrook, where they've traditionally gone. That's about 20 students. And then we're providing you our low and high models as well, so that you have those numbers to benchmark against. And that is the end of that presentation.
That's important, sorry. I noticed, I think I noticed, a disconnect between the graph of the midline and the numbers that were used in your, so if you go to the graph,
This graph?
the one before with the mid, yeah, that's that one. Are you saying the numbers that follow are the medium line? The medium line doesn't go above 4,500. Why do the numbers in your analysis go picking up those other numbers?
This is pre-K-12.
Because it's K-12. Okay, thank you.
Can I talk about?
Okay, you are offering these several alternative models as some representation or allowance for uncertainty, but this is only model uncertainty with respect to the smoothing technique you used to estimate the future cohort survival rates from the past survival rates. There is no allowance in these projections for uncertainty about the multipliers that you used to convert housing into students, as I understand it.
There is a difference between the three models in how many of the students we are assuming show up in Princeton Public Schools from the multipliers provided by.
Right, but there is no allowance for uncertainty in the multipliers. The multipliers were estimated from some historical data. I would bet that they are some kind of smoothed numbers estimated from individual other municipalities at particular times. And so there is uncertainty about the multipliers, which is not reflected in the uncertainty in these projections. So if you're recommending the range of those projections that are made from your models as a prudent range for use in making policy for the future, then you are underestimating the future variability, are you not?
I guess so, but I'd like Mr. Powell to speak to the multipliers.
Two brief comments. The multipliers that we use for these projections were taken from the American Community Survey report that targeted households in approximately 800,000 or 900,000 households in similar communities to Princeton in terms of income, demographics, education, and it only included public school age children in those households that had, quote, recently moved in. So the only households that are reported here are the ones that are relatively newcomers in those units. The data is the best data available by all accounts. It's used for litigation in a lot of contexts. However, the gentleman is right. It is backward looking. It covers a period over the last 6 or 7 years in these census tracts that model Princeton. So it is possible that looking ahead, these multipliers will change. And here's what I will say to the audience about the likelihood of the nature of a potential change in those multipliers. We know that since America came out of the Great Recession, the trend toward housing among American people is to increasingly move toward smaller housing and a huge trend toward more multifamily housing than single-family housing. As housing prices have continued to rise in proportion to family incomes in America since the recession, affordability has been an enormous problem for all homeowners who are middle and lower upper income households. And the result of that is that if you look at the public school age children that were occupying apartments prior to the Great Recession, the multipliers were relatively low. After the Great Recession, the number of families who would have preferred to have a single-family home but couldn't afford one are now occupying nice, new, modern apartment buildings. Those multipliers may change, but they are likely to go in the other direction over the next 10 years only if we can expect a material reduction in the cost of new housing in America compared to family incomes. And in my humble opinion, that is highly unlikely. So, there is an uncertainty. I'm always impressed with something that Nobel Prize-winning physicist Niels Bohr once said. Predictions are difficult, especially when it comes to the future. And that's what we're doing here tonight. But public policy requires that we make predictions. And they require that those predictions be credible and based on the best available data that's around. And we're all attempting to do that here tonight.
First of all, thank you everybody, and a wonderful job you guys are trying to do. But I like to add, and which I discussed with you at January 25th meeting, it's a very difficult analysis. I think what people are looking for is worst case analysis. It's not medium, it's not low, it's not high. It's 1 sigma, 2 sigma, 3 sigma, which is what takes the uncertainties into your assumptions. So it's a very simple analysis called Monte Carlo analysis. If anybody wants to talk about it, I'll be glad to do that, and we do that in rocket science all the time. What it does is basically doesn't just take into your assumptions what your variables are, but it puts the uncertainty on top of it. And then it calculates what the best case is, what's the worst case is, and then the people can drive some conclusions about it. The other part is that there are many other variables, and that analysis will take into account that too. We are focusing on a very narrow study here, and that's just Princeton Public Schools. There are many other schools in Princeton. We need to understand what are they doing, what are their future plans, what is charter schools is doing, and also that model can take into account not just the 5 years. You need to look at the history, and that's where the statistical analysis come in. You cannot ignore that. The trends and economics will come on. The population growth and birth rate will change, and that model will take into account that. So what I will suggest is that, yes, you guys have done a wonderful job, and I will continue to really say that there are many other methods that you could do and you should do so that the public can have a very clear picture. What are we looking for it? What are the best cases? What are the worst cases? From statistical analysis perspective, not like a standard, what are the growth rates, but we have to put uncertainty on top of that, and that's what that analysis does. So my point is that there are many variables that we need to consider, not just look at the Princeton Public School, but all the school system in Princeton. What are their plans? We don't even know. What is charter school? Are they going to have a high school? What does that mean to us? What are the other new schools that may come into factor? What are they thinking? What are our children looking for it? There will be many special schools. So we need to look at all that. So my perspective is basically look at a bigger picture, not at a narrow picture. But you guys have done a great job. Continue to do that. Let's not stop there, and let's get to the bottom of it, make the right decision. So that will be my 2 thoughts, and I agree with you, what you were talking about, and I understand that very well.
Sure. Right, let me just make one more point. All these models are models, and a model is basically a collection of assumptions.
some of the assumptions are about how certain parameters in the model estimated from the past will continue into the future, but there are also estimates about the form of the model. And for example, there are non-public schools in Princeton, one of which, the St. Paul Parish School, I don't think you've even recognized the existence of. At least it's not in your map of the schools that propose to enumerate the non-public schools in the Princeton area that draw from Princeton students. It is not inconceivable that a private school will collapse financially. It's happened in the past. I don't anticipate that the St. Paul Parish School is going to collapse. But if it does, it's going to dump its students into the public schools. Should you make a provision in your capacity for that sort of catastrophe? I don't know. But whether you make it or not is going to be a risk-taking policy decision that the board must make. It's not something that's going to be allowed for by this kind of analysis of alternative models that are smooth into the future from the past. So the board needs to consider several models, and it's going to make some policy decisions. Those, I hope, will include some reserves of capacity against failures of the model infallibly to predict the future. Thank you.
So I just want to take a step back and first of all say there's a tremendous amount of work and a tremendous amount of analysis that was done, and thank you. And I want to thank the board and the district for allowing for this session and for basically allowing the community to stress test the data that you're putting up there. I also want to acknowledge the tremendous amount of work that was done by the two committees here. And Ralph and Bob, thank you, because you bring the lens of analysis, the lens of the market forces to the knowledge of us as a community. And I think all of this really comes through. The other thing I wanted to just step back and say is it's easy for all of us to sort of get into the weeds and start looking at multipliers and things like that. And, you know, I know a little bit about that because I teach at a planning school, and people do that all the time. But if you take a step back, what we're talking about is something that I've been hearing about from parents in the community for over 4 years now, which is that our schools are overcrowded, our children are overcrowded, older facilities, and we're looking, as together, to work out the best solution possible. And I just wanted to ask people, let's not do paralysis by analysis. Let's work together and let's take this as a really great step forward. This is something the community has asked for. I want to thank the effort that's been put into this, and let's use this as a way to try to think of the best options possible that I know the board and you and is going to bring us back to the community as well.
I feel like you just stole mine. That's what I wanted to say. So, thank you. And, you know, it's funny because sitting here, I didn't make it to the last meeting, but thank you very much for your work. And I have to applaud your ability to stay on your message because I was having trouble following and I wasn't even trying to present. But it seems like there are some folks here who have ideas about maybe there should be a standard deviation, a plus or minus whatever. It might be more helpful just to put that out. So if you don't like the number, what is the number you think is right? So instead of everybody kind of sitting through this exhaustive weed-picking exercise, if we just know that, you know, maybe you, sir, would like to see a plus or minus 10% of students added to this. If we could just know what those numbers are and just do that analysis instead of all the what if, maybe that would make people more comfortable. So, it sounds like you're arguing about the total numbers and how they achieved them. And if I were arguing as hard as you were, I would have a number in mind that I thought was accurate, because all that happens in the community is uncertainty. And what we need is we need to come together and work together, because we're already overcrowded and it's really hard. So I think in the spirit of moving everybody forward, if I understood what was wrong with these numbers, you're 50 short or you're 50 over, it would be much easier to understand and for everybody to work together if we understood what the sticking point is. So I would just ask if anybody has submitted those to you, maybe you, okay, because I think that would make this more fruitful. Thank you.
I'm sorry, we're out of time.
That's what I was saying. Who's ready to go home? Two comments. First of all, just back to the comment I made before, it would be good to see some sort of range, a table of what were the major contributing factors to the change out in 5 years. How much of it came from the new developments, how much came from the existing, etc. The second, I know enough about Monte Carlo simulation just to be dangerous, but it seems to me, without getting a scientist involved up here again, that it takes into account a lot of uncertainties in a logical fashion. And I was wondering if you could just comment as to whether you've ever seen that used in these situations where you're, instead of just taking 3 random guesses as to a range of 90% in 5 years, if you just use ranges of uncertainty and then ran them through a model. I'd just like to hear you speak about that, or anybody in your field.
I've never seen them used in enrollment projections. I've never seen that type of analysis.
Okay, thank you.
Rebecca, you asked a question before, and in different ways, both Brian and Bob sort of gave the answer. I'd like to try to connect the dots among all 3 of your comments. Earlier, you asked me, in essence, why I thought it was so important to have such granular detail about the multifamily. Brian made the observation that going forward, we're going to be building different kinds of housing units, and the question is, should we be building more duplexes or more apartments or what have you? Bob pointed out accurately that the American Community Survey information, which led to the multipliers, is in fact a look backward. So my plea is, in order to look forward accurately, my plea is for us to better understand the present and the immediate past few years. And here's what I mean by that. I don't mean to criticize the multipliers, but I worked some of the math in some of the multipliers that you did, Bob. There's a multiplier for affordable housing units at Franklin and at 900 Herringtown. If you apply that multiplier, there's also a multiplier that you used for the market units. If you use that multiplier and apply it to what's known at Avalon we know that there's 56 affordable units, and we know there's 224 market units. If you use the multiplier you used for affordable units, and the multiplier you used for market units, and apply it to what's known at Avalon, you would come up with an enrollment today of 115 students at Avalon. In fact, we know that the enrollment today is 84 students. So I don't mean to stand here and criticize, only just to suggest that, actually make a plea rather than a suggestion, that going forward, we have 800 housing units recently built, which are the template for the next 800 that we're going to build. The likelihood that if we build 200 or 300 units at the shopping center, half a mile away from where Avalon is now, and Avalon builds another 200 units half a mile away from theirs, and if the units are comparable, it's pretty reasonable to assume the demographic characteristics of the people who live in those units are going to be very similar. At the very least, we should know exactly all the numbers about the 800 units we've just built, and then compare them to the results we get when we make projections going forward. If we take the data that we actually have today about those projects, and if they confirm multipliers that we have, then it gives us tremendous confidence that our multipliers are spot on. If there turns out to be a divergence, then rational people would ask themselves, okay, what's more a reliable predictor? What we've just experienced in the last 2 or 3 years in our community, knowing that we're building the same sort of product again in the next 5 years, or, or perhaps the multipliers aren't right. I have no crystal ball, but I'm just suggesting that we have a tremendous data source in the information that we have generated in our community just over the last few years, and we would be remiss if we didn't use it.
All right, I just wanted to put it on record. I think I didn't get the answer as to whether the double counting issue is indeed an issue in your model. The base of survival model, if you're using the historical data that includes multifamily and single family, everything included together, and that generates the sort of a baseline growth of the future. That effectively includes everything, right? If you use that as a baseline, essentially you're assuming in the next 10 years, we will have about 800 units of multifamily units being built and occupied in the next 10 years. That's already embedded in the cohort survival model. And then, on top of it, we add the multifamily unit, students from the multifamily units. That's double counting. All right, I'll leave it at that. The issue with the analysis is when the superintendent was talking about we're going to make evidence-based decision and there's no preconceptions as where things will go. Then I look at how the model assumption is made. One simple fact that you actually acknowledge is that it's the NJDOE standard to use a 6-year average to project out for the next 10 years. In your 3 scenarios, not just 1, 2, not just 2, all 3 of them using shorter than 6-year average, that's standard practice, and all these shorter tenures include a period of higher growth. So if all 3 scenarios you're using sort of above average growth in the recent past, that seems to suggest there's a supreme level of confidence that 4-year growth, above average growth, or above trend growth is going to extend for the next 10 years. Frankly, I just don't see it in the presentation. I think there's more work needs to be done to prove to the community that there are indeed factors that's driving this kind of growth for the next 10 years. And one interesting point, I just want to point it out.
Last point.
Last point, yes. When we look at the population growth, it's actually interesting. I don't know whether it's because people call it 2010 is the beginning of decades, so we start from 2010. I actually compiled the data from the same source, Department of Health, Public Health. In 2009, the data between 2010 to 2018, you said there's almost 10% growth in this town's population. But in 2009 alone, that 1 year, that bar just missing from the chart, that 1 year alone had a 7% decline in Princeton population. So you're telling me that in the next 10 years, all of these cyclicality is no longer exist. The past 4 years is going to be representative for the next foreseeable 10 years. I need to see stronger evidence to suggest that's the case.
Jan, I'll answer.
Jan, your problem with 2009 and 2010 is the following. All those numbers from the New Jersey Department of Health are the U.S. Census annual population estimates. And 2010 was the last decennial census and is the reason we used that year. That was the last year of a direct count. 2009 was the American Community Survey, a population estimate. It was based on an erroneous 2000 census. Now, ironically, most people in town don't realize that we were miscounted in 2000. The township grew substantially during the 90s, and the census was accurate with respect to the township. But it counted a 2,300 increase in the population of the borough. When I came to Princeton in 2006 and I started working on a traffic committee, I looked at that number and said, that doesn't make sense, because it went up in the borough 2,500. The next decade, in 2010, it came back down to an almost similar number to what it was in 1990. The reason was they double counted the graduate students, and the reason was the university didn't want the census takers going in the dormitories, and so the census takers filed their report, and the university sent in a report, and the census counted both of them. And nobody knows that, and even in our own demographers' charts, you'll see 2000 go like this, and then it comes back down. 2009 is the worst possible year to use. It was totally erroneous. 2010 was the best, more accurate count.
I also just want to address one thing. In our median projection model, we are using the 3-year average, right? And as we looked at, Merwick has been stable the last 3 years. Avalon is approaching stability in its enrollment. And so to say that our projections are assuming the construction and occupancy of 800 units is, I don't believe, accurate. Because those units were, in the past 3 years, largely occupied. It's not new occupancy at Merwick. Yes, Copperwood is ramping up. Avalon is still taking on some enrollment, but it wasn't, it appears to be stabilizing. So it's not quite as cut and dry as you're making it sound.
So some of that were wrong.
Some of that what?
Some of the scenarios were wrong. Right?
There's no right or wrong scenarios. They're all based on different assumptions. You have 5 options here that are all showing the same general trend.
Some of the scenario that the effect of double counting are more pronounced.
No. You have 5 models, different assumptions. I believe Mr. Sundell.
Okay, let's just, we've had a wonderful discussion. Thank you, Rebecca and Pat. And we'll see you, some of us will see you back here tomorrow. And I wanted to thank everybody for coming. Again, I recognize some people at the beginning who put a lot of work into this. There's been a lot of good discussion. I took a lot of notes. There's a lot to think about. And we have 4 of the 10 board members here, and I think that our heads may collectively explode if we stay 1 minute longer. But I remain extremely grateful to Ralph and to Bob, who are not just community members, they really are among the great experts in our country at what they do. And the fact that they're willing to give us as much time as they've given us and do it on a pro bono basis, we're really, really happy about that. And Ralph, we have a few projects lined up for your 90s. Anyway, thank you all for coming out. The discussion will continue.
Thank you.